Welcome to ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesday. Today's segment is Issues and Insights, sponsored by Pacific Forum CSIS. And now your host, international business lawyer David Day.
Well, good afternoon. We are going to be talking about Japan's politics, heads up for shifting winds, and our guest today is the executive director of Pacific Forum, Mr. Brad Glosserman. And Brad, welcome to the show.
Konnichiwa, David. It's nice to be back.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, you may not know this, or you may have forgotten from some of the other Pacific Forum shows, but
or repressed it.
Repressed it. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Because we will be talking about Japan, won't we? So that we can use that word. Okay.
Be nice.
So. But Brad was formerly one of on the editorial board of the Japan Times, so he has a lot of background and insight into Japan, and we want to talk about the political situation there. And so maybe, Brad, let's start first with kind of take a look at what's happened on the surface in terms of the internal political dynamics in Japan. There have been some elections and some shifts there. So let's start at that point.
It's been an active couple of months in Japan. Some of the developments have been intriguing. They're kind of fun. They're certainly enough to make you rather cynical about Japanese politics. And then I think if you put those developments within the context of a longer range process, whether you choose, gosh, the aughts, as you will, the first decade of this century, and go even further back to the 1990s, and you've got a long and disillusioning process. So we got lots to talk about. It's going to be fun if as long as everyone has their Prozac. Otherwise, but let's talk about.
Come on now.
Well, we can. Let's start with the last couple of months, and
okay.
the biggest developments I think that certainly that need to be recognized are the two political party elections that have been held. As you know, the Japanese are sort of powerful political parties. The party presidents assume very, very important positions in the political systems. So, if you're the president of the party, your party wins the legislative elections, then by default your president becomes the prime minister.
Well, in terms of so our audience understands the difference. You have the major parties,
right?
LDP and the DPJ.
The Liberal Democratic Party, sometimes called Jaminto, and the Democratic Party of Japan, the Minchito. And as you can tell from the two names, they're not real different.
And so what's the kind of the ideological bent between the two parties?
Pretty much have a hard time telling either of them, if they put them in the mirror, they look just like each other. Their ideology is not a particularly big deal in Japan, which is part of the problem here. You have two parties that have been largely opportunist, and for whom they essentially have individuals that represent just about every point on the political spectrum, on economic issues, on political issues.
So what difference does it make what party you're in?
Well, some people would say the same thing about American politics, but a function of reward. It has, I would argue in a lot of ways it hasn't made a very big difference, and in some ways what you've seen in the last couple of years, interestingly enough, is the continuation of the old order politics. And from 1955 until 2009, when this current government took office, there has been rule by the Liberal Democratic Party, uninterrupted. In truth, there was an 18-month period when they were out of power, but that's an interesting...
Basically a one-party rule for quite a while.
Pretty much. And the political system was built to perpetuate that. But what's interesting is that while the Democratic Party of Japan, when it took power in 2009, promised a different government, different set of priorities. In fact, they've had some real issues taking power. The first couple of years were somewhat lost and confused. But what you've really seen since they've taken office, or since they've sort of found their footing, is a continuation of the policies, the mainstream policies of their predecessors. And I would argue that one of the real sources of ire, anguish, irritation on the part of the opposition is that the government is doing what the opposition couldn't do when it was in power. So, is it the narcissism of small differences? But, and that makes for a really interesting political competition. And what I would argue is that there isn't a great deal to differentiate the two parties. And the movements that we've seen between them in elections has oftentimes been a function of where does the party leadership see a gap? In other words, originally, for example, the LDP championed farmers and agricultural interests.
Okay. Okay.
And so the Democratic Party said, okay, we're going to protect, we're going to instead favor the urban interests. You know, modernizing Japan. This is a recognition of changes, and so over time they picked up some support, and then the LDP would kind of move towards this new modern, if you will, political environment. And then the DPJ said, well, hey, there's an opportunity here. We'll start backing the farmers, and it's also because once they're in power that you want to support, keep the votes that you've got to appease the constituencies that are appeased, and so then they would move towards to support the agricultural interests, and then there would be a gap in terms of what was available in metropolitan. Just you've got this extraordinary opportunism in terms of the party shifting positions, if you will, to exploit the moment, and it's very tactical and it's very frustrating, and it's bred a certain amount of cynicism and apathy. But we've managed to get way off the point.
Well, all right. So let's go back to the
party elections.
Party elections. So we have this gentleman by the name of Shinzo Abe.
Tell you what, before we go to Abe, let's start with Noda, because Noda is the easy one. Noda, Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda, is the prime minister. Has been in office for about a year, and has done a pretty good job, I think, of solidifying, getting his party on an even keel. Putting a floor, if you will, under its losses. Party support's about 27, or at least cabinet support's in the upper half of the 20s.
He has survived.
He's survived, and he's actually more popular than that. He's the most popular. The cabinet is popular, and then the party itself is probably in the 17s or 18s in terms of public opinion. He was up for re-election in a party vote and managed to, I think, predictably, was re-elected the party president, so he stays on as prime minister.
Okay.
So he's pretty much the guy who, if there's an election, will be leading the party into the election. And we can talk about why, but that's I think, the starting point. You've got continuity in the government. No surprise there. So the second election is this for the Liberal Democratic Party in the opposition. And you've got, growing political frustration or public frustration with the political parties. The LDP has been scoring a little, has the last couple of months begun to best the DPJ in terms of popular appeal. Not by much, but now it's up to maybe 10, 12 points depending on whose poll.
So the LDP is the opposition now.
Right.
They're coming up. Okay.
They're having their own party elections, and they're thinking the logic is that we need to position the party. We need a party leadership that is prepared to govern the country, or to lead the party into an election and to make a public mass appeal and to prevail in that vote whenever it's going to be held. There has to be an election by 2013, I think August or so. So you had about 5 different candidates for the party election. There were 3 of them that I think are worthy that we need to be mentioned. One is Shinzo Abe, this guy who had previously been a prime minister when in 2005-06 when Junichiro Koizumi stepped down, and he was prime minister for 1 year, and something of a nationalist politician, fairly conservative, comes from a very distinguished political family. The second candidate was a guy named Nobuteru Ishihara, who has, again, a distinguished political lineage. His father is the governor of Tokyo metropolitan district area. They call it the TMG, Tokyo Metropolitan Government, which is like a province. Okay. And he's the guy who's the former novelist, very famous troublemaker. He was one of the co-authors of the Japan That Could Say No back in the late 80s, I think it was, or early 90s. And he's been the guy who's been sort of pushed off this whole dispute with China over the Senkakus. He's the one that wanted to buy it because he's always...
This is the father.
Right. He's a bit of a right-wing nationalist, and he's always trying to be a troublemaker. And this is his son, who is not quite as, let's say, extreme as Dad, but nevertheless is said to represent... I think some people thought maybe he could deliver some of Dad's supporters. And by no means is he a puppet. But he's also got a fairly distinguished pedigree within the party, served in top positions. Slightly younger image and a little more moderate. Then the third guy was a former defense minister named Shigeru Ishiba. And again, somewhat conservative, but nevertheless slightly more smiling face. And there were a couple of other guys. But those were, to my mind, the 3 top candidates in the
opposition party.
In the opposition party election. Okay. Now, to put my cards on the table, I thought that Ishihara was probably going to prevail.
Okay.
I was wrong. So, that everything that follows from the rest of the hour, okay. I was wrong on this one. You had a vote, and Ishiba actually prevailed in the first vote between all 5 of the candidates. And then the top 2 participate in a runoff. So it was Abe against Ishiba. Okay. And in the second round of the vote, Abe prevailed.
All right.
So Abe's now the guy going forward. Now,
what's the significance of that?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, that was the first time in 47 years, I think, so that the LDP, a party election, had gone into a runoff. Normally, it's a fixed, the cards are in, it's a done deal. So it didn't happen. Secondly, is the first time in 60-something years that the person who won the first round did not win the second. So I think it was Ishiba won the first round, but Abe won the second. And why is that? Why is that, you asked, David? Let me tell you. I'm glad you asked that. The reason is because the election...
You can do this show by yourself. Go ahead.
I've always thought you were sort of extra here. I hope we're not paying him much. Because in the first round of the vote, it's split between two different groups. You have the electors themselves, the representatives of the Diet voting, and you have representatives from each of the districts throughout Japan. So in other words, it's like, if you will, it's an inside the Beltway vote and the head of all the political districts in the country. And so in that round, when you've got the outsiders, if you will, voting, they're all thinking, who is it that we want represent the face of the party going into an election? And they're, interestingly enough, casting their votes for Ishiba. Second round, in the runoff, the district people don't vote. It's just the guys in the Diet.
In the Beltway.
In the Beltway, if you will. And so in that case, Abe prevails. So now what you have is this former prime minister who quit after 1 year, who is pretty much considered a fairly hawkish conservative, leading the party into this election. And, I mean, when he had previously been prime minister, he had only served 10 or 11 months and then had what was ultimately, was a medical condition that obliged him to step down. Some people said it was close to a nervous breakdown. So I thought that, frankly, that the conservative reputation with his previous performance was going to be enough to discredit him.
Okay.
And I was wrong.
So does that mean that look into your crystal ball for a second here. Is Abe likely to resume the prime ministership of Japan?
We'll find out after the break.
Okay. We'll see you on the other side. Stay with us.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
We're back. We're live, and you can call us at area code 808-296-5467 and talk to Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS. We're talking about Japan's politics, heads up for shifting winds. And before we get back to Brad Glosserman and the crystal ball question of the day here, what's going to happen in the prime minister elections coming up, leadership revolving door in Japan or what? Before we get to that, I'd like to bring on ThinkTech's Field Marshal Jay Fidel to talk a little bit about a fabulous program that is coming up. So, Jay, are you with us?
Yes, I am, David. I want to spend a minute and just tell you about the next ThinkTech Hawaii Venture Capital Association luncheon program at the Plaza Club. It's called Is UH Meeting Its Tech Research Goals? Is UH meeting its tech research goals? There's lots of questions in that question. It's on Thursday, October 25th. It goes from 11:30 to 1:30 p.m., as I said, at the Plaza Club. And maybe it's a show of support for UH at this point, which would be helpful. We want to bring the university downtown, bring it together with the business community. So we have a panel, including our moderator, Yuka Nagashima, who is the president, the CEO of the High Tech Development Corporation, the state's senior technology officer. And then we have a panel from the university featuring Tom Apple. He's the chancellor, you remember that. And with him, Michele Carboni, who is the leader of the Cancer Research Center of Hawaii, Peter Crouch, the dean of the engineering school, Jairus Hedges, the dean of the John A. Burns School of Medicine, Peter McGinnis-Mark from SOEST, the School of Ocean and Earth Science, and Rick Rocheleau from the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. This is going to be a great discussion of what research is going on, what goals we have, whether we're meeting those goals, and how things are doing at the University of Hawaii. So come on down, sign up at hvca.org. Given all the things that are happening, swirling around the universities these days, I think it's going to be a very popular program, David.
That's great, Jay. Thank you so much. And let's go back now to our topic, talking about swirling around with Japanese politics with Brad Glosserman here. And right before the break, Brad, I asked you to look into your crystal ball, and we now have Shinzo Abe as the leader of the opposition party, the LDP in Japan, and you were saying there's going to need to be an election before August of 2013, something like that. So from your vantage point now, does it look like Abe is going to resume the mantle of Prime Minister of Japan, or will Noda survive?
As I try to think about it, I can't give you a definitive answer, obviously, but I can't even come up with an answer that I'm happy with.
Well, that's a start.
Yeah, which could well be a metaphor for Japanese politics more generally these days. The problem is that certainly neither the LDP nor the DPJ, the Liberal Democrats, or the current ruling party, the Democratic Party, commands more than a third of the electorate. If you were to hold an election, neither of them would command a majority, even with the support of one or two of the third and fourth parties. They're both so small. And the bigger issue, I think, is just the larger element of disillusionment and cynicism that is found throughout the Japanese electorate. You know, the folks that I've talked to in Japan for the last few years or few months, including the politicians, with rare exception, you know, if you speak to the opposition side, you know, their attitude among the LDP is well, gee, if we were back in power, we would show them how to run the country, and all it takes is a firm and steady hand on the tiller, when it sort of neglects all of the problems that actually brought the DPJ to power in 2009. And so a return, if you will, to the old order, which in truth hasn't been much of a departure from these days, it doesn't sound to me like a real recipe for taking power. And, you know, the cynicism among the electorate's quite understandable. Yeah.
Well, okay, so let's talk then about the malaise, the cynicism, the insecurity, and let's shift our focus, if we could, for a moment from Tokyo to the political developments that have been taking place with the rise of the Japan Renewal Association, the third party, in Osaka.
Right. That's the neat story. And you've got the rise of an extraordinary populist politician by the name of Toru Hashimoto, who's a former lawyer, who is, frankly, sort of a television personality and who's just really learned to play the media. I would say he's kind of a 21st century Ishihara in some ways in terms of his popularity. He was a mayor of Osaka, which is, as you know, a very different kind of political and business environment than Tokyo, and has actually in many ways sort of ridden this, if you will, a wave of Osaka, a sense of Osaka's being ranked second and wanting to sort of level the playing field. So a big component of his drive toward political leadership has been the desire to turn Osaka into a metropolitan area like Tokyo, so that it becomes almost a rival, both a political and business center.
So this is kind of like the old Hertz-Avis rivalry kind of thing.
Well, more in the sense that this has been what is considered to be the engine of the Japanese economy in many ways, but nevertheless it doesn't carry the same weight politically, and so there's an attempt to level that playing field, and that's always been an issue in Japanese politics about the way in which the regions, and there are 47 different prefecture in Japan, the degree to which they have independence and the degree to which they're going to be able to marshal the resources and control their own destinies. Interestingly enough, it's the regional governments and the regional governors that have historically been sort of the sources of political innovation. And every couple of years, somebody pops up from one of the regions that sort of says, ooh, this guy's going to be the center of a new political universe. And then they typically flame out. This guy, Hashimoto, is shown to have a little bit more staying power. And he started his own party, which was originally called Ishin no Kai, which is sort of the Osaka, the Restoration Party. And it's become a larger it's declared its national ambitions, and it's going to try to become a national political party.
What is the significance of his rise in a kind of a populist movement in Japan? Is that a product of this frustration with the two primary parties?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, it's a function of a 20-year-long process that began, with the bursting of the bubble in 1991 and a failure, if you will, to get on track in many ways, and then it's been magnified by a political revolving door since 2005 when Koizumi left office, and the disillusionment that culminated in 2009 with the switch again. The LDP lost power, and then you've seen the DPJ unable to gain traction except in the last year or so, and then it's still been kind of a very, very tentative process. And then on top of all of that, the mishandling of what happened in Fukushima, the loss of trust in government, all of this has fed a distrust of the prevailing mentality of the prevailing parties, as well as, an inability, quite frankly, to judge, to say what's the difference between them. And so it's a yearning. It's created a yearning in the Japanese people in many ways for someone who can get them out of this mess. And Hashimoto is he's an affable, personable-looking guy, very abrasive in some ways. But many of the people in Japan are vesting their hopes on him. And the problem is, of course, he's relatively untested. He's a big fish in a small pond. What's going to happen when he tries to go national? All sorts of logistical issues, related to both creating a political party, creating a political platform, and whether or not, either his appeal will continue to grow or whether the whole process
is Hashimoto a nationalist?
It's hard to say. I mean, in some ways, he clearly wants to do some things that look like nationalism or patriotism, and that's a long and interesting debate, and we're going to talk more about that later, I suppose. Because right now in Japan, not being patriotic is probably not a winning card. Although I'm not sure when being patriotic is ever a winning card anywhere. But given the external environment and given what's going on, and we're not going to talk a lot about the Senkaku as you promised. Clearly, you've got to have a national leader, or someone who's running for the national leadership, who's
pushing that patriotic button.
Yeah, we're going to defend our territory, and no one's going to push us around.
Interesting. I wonder how somebody with that coming from Osaka that has never been in national politics, I guess that would be a major revolution for him to take the national stage, or not?
It's always an ambitious an undertaking, and I think that clearly you don't get to be where he is without having an ego. Now, the problem, of course, is that you've got to have, at the end of the day, Japan, you said in the run-up, who's going to be elected the prime minister? You don't elect the prime minister. You elect a party to be the majority party in the Diet, which is the legislature, and they pick their leader to lead them, who becomes, it's a parliamentary system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's no direct vote. So, at the end of the day, Hashimoto has to muster the political numbers to make himself a presence within the legislature such that he can then exercise influence either directly or indirectly. There's no way in hell this guy's going to get enough seats, even enough candidates, if you will, because it takes money, to run around the country in sufficient numbers to become a representative force. At best, he becomes a third force, or either a nudge, if you will.
Well, what's the fate in Japanese political history, Brad, of third parties in Japan?
Interestingly enough, there is already a dominating third party, a very powerful one. I've likened them to the Free Democratic Party in German politics for many, many years. It's called the Kome, or New Kome Party, which is very closely affiliated with Soka Gakkai. Historically, it has been affiliated with the Liberal Democratic Party. It is a Buddhist organization. It has a very distinct pacifist tinge to it, which of course creates certain issues with this conservative resurgence. But they are I think they deliver about 8 million votes, and they are quite skillful at making sure that they get their candidates elected, to the point where they actually, it's well known within Japan that you always have to give Soka Gakkai a month to move their actual party members to register in the appropriate districts so that they can be physically present and registered to vote so that their vote has the maximum impact in an election.
Interesting.
And, this is just one of those well-known games that's played. And so it has something to do with the negotiations between LDP, with who they historically work together with, and the Kome leadership in making sure that the right party, the right person's nominated, that there are enough electors in each district, such that that they can maximize all of their limited voting power. They've been an extremely influential force. Quite truthfully, I've been very surprised over the last few years that Kome has stuck with the Liberal Democratic Party and actually hasn't shifted support to the DPJ.
Interesting. We've been talking about shifting winds in Japanese politics, and we're going to focus.
We're going to take a break.
We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to look at a possible rightward shift. We'll see you on the other side.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
We are back. We are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. We're talking about Japanese politics and the shifting winds therein. Our guest in the studio with us is Pacific Forum's Executive Director, Mr. Brad Glosserman. And if you just tuned into the show from the outset, we were talking about in the kind of internal political dynamics taking place in Japan, the
weeds.
We've been down in the weeds here.
Down in the weeds.
And so we're going to surface now. And what we want to talk about
the sexy stuff
is this possibility. What do you think, Brad, of some kind of does it look like a rightward shift, a movement to the right, more conservative in Japanese politics?
I say ha. I would pound the table, except there's a sign that says please don't pound the table. No, it's a common perception. I've had one of my fellows in the office this afternoon, slightly worried about
what you were going to say today?
No, I mean, she's already written that off. This is my boss. But no, I'm concerned about this conservative rightward militarist shift. And then she stopped and said, or maybe I'm just reading too much of the Chinese press. And I was nodding vigorously at that. It's a nice theme. It's a nice trope. It's a good story. In fact, I've seen almost every day, I think just either this morning or yesterday afternoon, the Washington Post, Chico Harlan, who knows Japan pretty well, was writing about that. Reuters has done lots of stories. I mean, it's a good hook. I mean, it's a wonderful news hook. It's wrong, but it sells copy, as we like to say.
So no shift to the right.
No, I mean there is an evolution in Japan, and what we've seen essentially, and I've said this a couple of times earlier in the program, that there's far more continuity than shift in Japanese politics over the last decade. And certainly across the last two administrations, despite this radical shift. And in fact, it's disillusioned a lot of DPJ supporters. But it's not been any grand transition. I mean, what we're seeing is movement that is evolutionary at best, and and certainly most folks, I think, would say, is in fact far too slow given the broader shift in the external security environment. But nevertheless, for years we've been arguing that the Japanese, and from the Americans' perspective, the Japanese were freeloaders on our alliance, which wasn't true, but they may not have performed as much as we wanted them to, that they didn't meet expectations. But they have been doing too little, that they were, quote, abnormal, and they needed to become a more normal country. And we're seeing movements in that direction, but by no means are they normal yet, which begs the question, of course.
What's normal?
Is it good for them to be abnormal, I suppose, is one way to look at it. But what you've seen in the last couple of years is and the way to think about it is that in the last decade, what you've had is a discrediting of the extreme left in the Japanese political spectrum. You had political parties that were just flatly saying, North Korea is a benign, they're just misunderstood, that these accusations regarding all these kidnappings of Japanese nationals is fantasy, that the Chinese are going to rise and it's going to be just like the equivalent of any other power. And it's not been like that. And so the people that were making those claims have been, I think, rightfully discredited. North Korea has proven to be a threat, a menace, a soprano state. China has not been the benign rising peace. It hasn't been the peaceful rise that some people had hoped, that many of us hope. And the Japanese are responding to that. And I think that so what you've seen, rather than, if you will, a shift to the right, is a shift in the center of gravity because the political spectrum has been changed.
In other words, the radical left has been lopped off, and
yes.
So it looks like there's been a shift when there really hasn't been.
Yeah, exactly. And you certainly still you see no change in the Constitution. At best, we're talking about a change in the interpretation of the Constitution that would permit the exercise of the right of collective self-defense, which means essentially that the Japanese would be able to defend the United States if its ally and partner is attacked. In other words, at this moment, if the Americans are attacked, the Japanese cannot come to our defense, while we are legally obligated to come to their defense. Those are the actual terms.
It's not really a mutual defense treaty.
It never was.
Okay.
So the point is that the Japanese would like not to change, I mean, some would like to change the Constitution, but they would like to at least change the interpretation so that they could actually defend their ally if a United States ship is attacked on the high seas, or if, for example, there is a UN peacekeeping mission for which the Japanese would be asked to dispatch forces, and they would be able to, defend themselves and the people that are around them. As it currently stands, whenever the Japanese are dispatched as part of peacekeeping units, they are, if they're side by side with Koreans, if they are under fire, the Japanese can only return fire if they themselves are attacked. They cannot, if you're standing next to me, someone shoots at me, they can't shoot back to defend me.
Jeez.
So one would argue that if that's, if changing that is a shift towards normality, hey, I'm all for it.
Brad, we talked around an issue that I think we need to get into for a big chunk of the program here, and that is the whole notion of at least from the outside, it looks like Japan is just suffering from an incredible political malaise of some kind. And sometimes when I think about Japan, I see a country that is very insecure and always worried, and I think to myself, well, was that because there was this big economic slide from the first Gulf War, or they've seen the rise of China, or better relations with the U.S. has had better relations and with South Korea, and South Korea is building its economy, and Japan is stagnant. And I put all these things together, it's just like people walking around the streets of Tokyo with their head hung.
You obviously haven't been to Tokyo lately because there's no head hanging there. But it's an interesting question, and it's a good one, and it's a big one. And you probably should have started the show with that. But hey, who am I to tell you how to do your job? But let's put it off. Let's start with let's tie it to your last question, which about the security. And I would begin with the Japanese in the post-war world have believed that they lived in a reasonably benign neighborhood. And I think that one of the great developments, or great important developments, of the last 15 years, and it began roughly in 1998 or so. And in fact, you can go back to 1995 when there was the first Taiwan Straits crisis, is the growing recognition among the Japanese that the world is not a warm and fuzzy place, and that Northeast Asia is a kind of difficult place to be. You've had increasing North Korean belligerence. You've had China's rise, which has not been as friendly, and it's been bruising, quite frankly. And on top of that, you've had the rise of South Korea, which has a historical rivalry with Japan for some pretty good reasons, and periodically tough shoulders and a little the friendly and not so friendly bumping of rivals. You've got questions about the United States and its commitment at times. We've seemed not to always put Japanese priorities at the top of the U.S. list of national national priorities, and that's to be understood, or is certainly understandable, but it depends on how you do it. You've got a historically poor and continuing poor relationship with Russia as well. So, in many ways, the Japanese you can understand a bit of insecurity. You've got territorial conflicts, by the way, with China, South Korea, and Russia. And in each of those have had varying degrees of belligerence. You've got historical controversy. You've got all sorts of reasons to feel literally physically insecure. Right. And you're bound by a constitution that essentially is, it's choose the use of war as an instrument of state policy. You've got a policy that has restricted defense spending to 1% of GDP, which is, you've breached that window once, I think, that ceiling once in the 80s, and largely has been declining despite all of these national security threats. You've had declining defense spending. You've got a demographic profile, the grayest country in the world and getting grayer, shrinking population. You have a lack of dynamism and vitality. So insecurity on one level, I think is sort of part of the 21st century Japanese condition. And so, to me, in a lot of ways, that feeds into this broader question of malaise, which let's push that back a little bit. But I also think it pretty much undermines the fundamental premise of a conservative resurgence in the country. The Japanese, everything is urging them to hunker down, to draw back, to almost disengage in some ways, internationally and regionally. And I would argue that the biggest problem that the world faces is not a Japan that's going to be resurgent or in any ways aggressive, which is not going to happen. But the danger is that the Japanese will just withdraw deeper into themselves and create a vacuum. Some might suggest that some of the problems we're seeing right now in Northeast Asia are a function of a sense of weakness in Tokyo, that the country is so distracted internally that neighbors are seeing this as an opportunity to exploit tactically or perhaps even strategically, and that the danger is a vacuum, not so much that the Japanese are being assertive, but they're pulling back.
And that provides a wonderful opportunity for countries like China.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, and of course China's driven by its own political dynamics as well, but I don't think that that's the internal political developments in Japan are clearly part of are I think shaping perceptions and always will. But so the broader question of insecurity I think is an important one. The second issue that you got to is one of confidence more generally, and that's a longer term process, but it also feeds into this notion of withdrawal. Decline is a harsh word, but it's one that one can look at, I think, and we can talk about in a structural sense over time.
You know, it's the question that many people listening to this show probably want to ask, but
they're just too shy to
call in. They're frightened of the Brad Glosserman mind.
I'm very nice.
He is. And you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. But the question they would ask you, Brad, is what? Oh,
they'd ask you is, what are you going to talk about when you come back?
What's going to be in the final section here? We'll see you on the other side. Stay with us.
Those calls.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
We're back, we're live, and we're talking with Brad Glosserman, Pacific Forum's executive director, and we're talking about Japanese politics. And the question I was about to put to you, Brad, right before the break, that I think is on a lot of people's minds is the notion of, you know, we see this obvious insecurity, frustration. We've talked about the malaise that exists, but we've also seen, you know, a country that really hasn't had much in the way of leadership for a long, long time. I guess we got to go back to Koizumi before we see some kind of
7 years. I mean, you and I are dealing with different time scales, David, but that's but yeah, there's something to be said for that.
It's the revolving door. When does it stop?
Yeah, true. There's some interesting to dissect Japanese politics risks going down into a level of detail that may put what few readers or listeners left to sleep. So I'll just try to do it. You know, we can try to do it in different voices. But and the other thing too is this is. You got to make it sound like we got to make sure that we're clear that you know. Remember, this is a sovereign country, and as Americans, we need to be real careful about how we talk about dysfunctional political systems these days. I wouldn't go too far.
You know what? Let's hold the answer to that. We have a caller on the phone.
We got him finally. Huh?
Leah, would you put the caller on the phone and? Who have we got that's calling? Oh, we drove blank here.
Hello.
Hello.
Who's calling? Just give a first name if you could, please.
Hi, David. My name is Karen.
Okay, Karen, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Los Angeles, California.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to Asia. Welcome to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. And you have some kind of a question or comment for us?
I do have a question. I had one question, and then the topic kind of changed by the time I was able to get through. So
go back. It's okay.
Question. Mr. Glosserman was saying that the internal political shift that's happening is creating a more insular Japan. And I'm just wondering what that means for its allies like us.
Good question.
In the overall view of Asia Pacific, because obviously if they become more insular, it's going to have an effect on us economically and every other possible way, because we're expected to protect them.
Yes.
At least that's my understanding.
That's pretty close to it. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of whether how the dynamics work. If it's the insular politics, insularity affecting politics, or politics affecting insularity. But the bottom line is that if the Japanese are dysfunctional and certainly focused on internal stuff and not dealing with the bigger problems that the country faces, whether it's creating a dynamic economy, unleashing the forces of Japanese entrepreneurism and innovation, of getting its diplomatic resources out of the country, then clearly, it's an asset that's underappreciated and underutilized. And obviously, as we talked in the last session about the degree to which the Japanese proved to be that neighbors sense weakness, then they may be tested. You see, I think to some degree what's going on in the Senkaku Islands is perhaps an attempt by the Chinese to reassert themselves, and obviously as a treaty ally, then we're going to be dragged into that. So there are some real dangers there. I think that what we need to be doing is one of the frustrations in many of the conversations we have is that we constantly telling our Japanese friends, quit being concerned about what you're not doing in your perceptions and just start doing something. And in many cases, if the Japanese, I think, were to marshal their really not inconsiderable resources, they could do a lot. I mean, they do have a high reputation. They have some extraordinary savings. They do have, the capacity to, deploy, whether it's diplomatic, economic, business, social, cultural resources on their behalf in ways that would benefit Japan and benefit the alliance, because they're our partners. We believe in the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
It did answer my question. It's just, I wonder, with them being very, the Japanese in business are exceedingly conservative, and they're very focused on their concerns, which I guess we all are. But I just wonder if this is a shift that's taking them even further away from, geoeconomic concerns and things like that, because obviously all of these economies are so tied together with ours.
So your question, Karen, really is whether the political shifts in Japan are indicative of a withdrawal from the geopolitical scene by the country as a whole.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they're interrelated without question. It's a really good question, by the way. And the answer is, when you speak to, Japan has historically been a bifurcated country. There's an economist in New York named Richard Katz who wrote, I think it's The Bifurcated Economy. It's a great book. It came out in the 90s. There's a part of the Japanese economy that has been very international, the Sonys, the Toyotas, the Sharps historically, the Panasonics, that were just world beaters. They were just hardened by international competition. And they knew and they understood how you had to get out into the world and what it took to make you a modern company and how to succeed. There was an equally powerful and perhaps even more powerful protected domestic economy, whether it was the agricultural sector, the services sector, the financial sector, that was cosseted and protected. And in many ways, the international companies, sort of provided, if you will, the international wherewithal to allow these inefficient sectors to prosper.
Yeah, they built a wall almost.
Exactly. And what we've seen is that these international, this over time, that these international companies have almost split in terms of dividing the country. And the debate in Japan really is, to what degree do we need to engage the rest of the world for the Japanese to continue to have and enjoy the lifestyles that they have? And, as I jokingly said to David, you go to Tokyo, there is no way that any visitor to Tokyo would ever think this is a country that has suffered 2 consecutive lost decades. I mean, obviously, if you've been there since the 80s, maybe you see more homeless people. And the homeless, of course, are lead very neat and organized lives in Japan. But it certainly doesn't look like an economy that has been has shown the slowest rates of growth among any of the OECD countries. So if you've got that level of comfort, your impetus to change, the driving force to engage and to shift out of your comfort mode to make the changes that make you a competitive economy more broadly, you don't quite have that engine.
Karen, we have another caller coming in on the line, and thank you for such great questions. I hope Brad answered your question for you.
Thank you so much for taking my call.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening from Los Angeles. We have another caller. Who is that? Hello?
Moshi moshi.
Okay. Maybe not. Maybe we
scared them.
We scared. Let me talk to our technical director, Leah. If there's another caller on the line, just let us know. And otherwise, Brad, you were talking before we had the caller from Los Angeles about you're beginning to talk about the answer to the question of the revolving door.
Right. And, I mean, yes, you've seen since Koizumi left office in 2005, prime minister every year. It's been a mix of political incompetence, of health issues, of did I say political incompetence? Because there's been a lot of that. And it's just, the fact is that the Japanese public is losing faith with its political class. That, to go back to the previous question from our listener, when you're changing and shifting the cabinet every couple of months, it's really difficult for the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State to get a reading on who their counterpart is, to want to arrange a visit. I mean, high-level visits like that take a lot of legwork, and you're not going to do it when you have no guarantee that that individual is going to be there for more than the next 2 or 3 weeks. Right. So this revolving door, whether at the top or the cabinet, has really impacted the ability of the Japanese to make foreign policy, to conduct its diplomacy with other countries, and yes, it profoundly impacts its capacity to do business.
So what you're saying is that the Japanese have the ability, if this political situation were to straighten out, they have the ability or the capacity to actually play a much more significant role geopolitically than they have.
Without question. I mean, no one should sell the Japanese short. I mean, and that's the most frustrating thing about dealing with Japan, is this sense of not reaching their own, of being able to do what we all hope and think they can do. The Japanese have extraordinary creativity, great resources. We'd like to see them do more, and the thing that's holding them back is themselves.
Well, what we are seeing now in the region of Northeast Asia there is the attempt by the United States to build a trilateral alliance between itself, South Korea, and Japan.
Trilateral relationship. The Japanese Constitution will prevent you from doing any alliances. Remember that?
I stand corrected.
No, I mean, but that goes to the heart of the question. I mean, in the sense that it's that fundamental constitutional issue about collective self-defense. The Japanese are very limited in what they can do. So, I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, David.
Well, no, but I'm glad you made that point, because my question was, this whole revolving door political malaise makes it so that the creation of that relationship between the United States, South Korea, and Japan that much more difficult.
Well, it does, but the other thing which I think we have to recognize, and this is occurring throughout the region right now, which is what makes this interesting, is that when you have a time of political transition and political uncertainty, your politicians are thinking not about grand national interests, but about domestic political interests. They're positioning themselves for the next election, for the next fight, and they're thinking about short-term little games to be played. So, to give you an example, if we've got time, in the last Diet, there was a vote of no confidence put forward by the opposition against the government.
Right.
And the vote of no confidence was basically saying that because of a deal that the Democratic Party struck with the opposition LDP to raise taxes, these parties have lost confidence. The Liberal Democratic Party voted with the Democratic Party, the government, to pass the increase in the consumption tax, and then turned around and voted in support of the vote of no confidence, which was essentially condemning the very vote that the LDP just voted for. So it voted against itself. That's the sort of cynicism, I think, that creates this phenomenal apathy, distrust, and the malaise that's in the Japanese political system.
There you have it. Developments in Japanese politics. Stay with us. Tomorrow we have a special program, Eyewitness Korea, View from the Other Side of the DMZ. Have a safe drive home.